Hello and welcome to those who are already joining us. We're going to get started in about 15 minutes. I just wanted to say hi and thank you so much for coming. We'll see you shortly. Hello and welcome to our first ever Wednesday workshop. My name is Josh McNeil and I'm the director of Lakeside's Neurologic Initiative. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and joining us this evening. I know that many of you are joining us live, and then some of you are going to be joining and watching the recorded version of this session. And so we're just really excited to be able to dive into some of this content that we believe is just so imperative and important for those that have the opportunity to work with children, whether you're an educator, an administrator, a homeschooler, a parent, a foster parent, or somebody who in any way, shape, or form interacts with young people. Real quick, just a little bit about who we are, where we come from. As I said, my name is Josh McNeil. I'm the director of what's called Lakeside's Neurologic Initiative. Lakeside is an organization in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia where we run several alternative schools, as well as having in-school and in-community counselors and educators. And so we've been working with the students who haven't done well in a traditional school setting, and through working with them, learned a lot about the brain, a lot about stress and trauma, and have applied that work into what it is that we do. And so as we were applying that work, we began to start what's called our Neurologic Initiative, which is where we go out and we provide training and consultation to schools and other organizations really all over the world, where we're really working with them to figure out what are these practical strategies that you can utilize to meet the needs of the young people who you're collaborating with and who you're trying to help support. And one of the things that I want to say, even about this event here tonight, is that I recognize that there is an eclectic group of people. There are, once again, educators and homeschoolers and those that work in a traditional school setting. There are those that work in private and religious sectors. There's those that work in businesses and in government. And so there's such a wide array of people. And I know that there's people from countries all over the world. But what I find fascinating is despite how we interact with children, and despite where it is that you happen to be, though the interaction is different, though the stress might be different, the brain really operates a lot of the same way. And so a lot of what we're going to be discussing through these Wednesday workshops are really universal ideas. Some elements, some strategies you may need to really specify for your specific setting, but so much of it's going to be applicable anywhere that you might happen to be working. My big goal with these sessions is just to provide support. We've been constantly hearing about schools that wanted more education, or communities and parents that wanted to learn more. And so we wanted to start these as an opportunity to just share that information with as many people as possible, just trying to support young people and hopefully supporting you in the process as well. And so with that said, throughout our time together today, please, if you have comments, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, type them into the comment bar. As we're going, I have a colleague, Alexandra, who's going to be responding to some of the questions that are short or simple responses. But then my goal tonight is to speak for about 45 minutes. And then the last 15 minutes of these Wednesday workshops, I really want to just take some time responding to the different questions that have come in throughout the time. And so I want to make sure that we're trying to be responsive to some of the specific needs that you might be encountering. And once again, I would ask you to be accepting of the fact that there's an eclectic group of people. And so some questions might not be specifically addressing the world that you're in, but just recognizing that really universally, there's a lot of people that are coming to this that are trying to find out how they can apply tools that are going to be applicable to them. So I look forward to this and hope that this is as meaningful a time as it possibly can be for you as we really dig into the content of this evening. So first and foremost, obviously, our topic today is recognizing and responding to stress in children. And so one of the things that I almost consider to be a silver lining of everything that's happening in the world right now is that finally things like mental health and stress are on the forefront of every conversation. And so we're recognizing the fact that adults and youth alike are experiencing a far higher dose of stress than they ever have before. And that's why we thought this is such an important topic to be kind of our foundational topic with these Wednesday workshops. But the one thing that I do want to say up front is that stress is not new. And I think that you know that, I think that you realize that, but it's not going away. See, what we have found from years and years of working with children, working in schools, supporting different organizations, is that stress has been on the forefront for a long time, but there was a lot of people who weren't paying attention for it. We were giving different labels to some of the behaviors that we were seeing. We were blaming a lot of young people for how they were acting. But the problem was we weren't recognizing that at the root of so many of those behaviors was this stress response that so many people were enacting. And so we want to be aware of that, not just right now, not just during this pandemic and during other things that are happening in various parts of the world, but we want to recognize that in 2, 3, 4 years, this information that we share is just as prevalent. The obvious stressors may not be quite as prevalent, but the reality is that stress is going to be just as prevalent as ever. And so we need to, once again, be attuned to that and make sure that we're understanding really what's at the root of so many of the issues that we might be seeing with some students that we're interacting with. Now, one of the things that's foundational to any work that I try and do now is to make sure that we're tying it in with a basic understanding of the brain. You know, I started my career as a teacher, and what I find fascinating about my education to become an educator is that we didn't talk about the brain at all. We talked a lot about how to teach, a little bit about classroom management, but none of it was done through a brain-based approach. And what I think is fascinating is that the more I've learned about the brain, I realized that my job as a teacher was literally to change students' brains, to help create new neural pathways that store different information than they had prior. And so my job was to work with my students' brains, yet I wasn't taught about it at all. And so now with any topic that I'm talking about, I always try and bring it back to the brain. I always try and make sure that we are kind of revisiting what it is that we're actually talking about and what things look like from this brain-based perspective. Now, some of you have heard me speak before. Some of you have heard me speak for many, many hours before, and others of you have never heard me speak. Now, what I want to say is that a couple of the slides for some of you that are returning are going to be refreshers. They're going to be some things that you've seen before. I'm going to try and do my best as often as possible to take kind of a different approach with it, but to also make sure that for those of you that are brand new to me and to this approach, that we kind of hit all the basics and that we make sense of the content that we're looking at. And so the brain is unbelievably complex, and throughout these different Wednesday workshops, we'll always touch on different elements of the brain and try to begin to get a fuller picture and understanding of what it is that we know about the brain. But when we start with it, we try to have the most basic foundation that we possibly can. And so our starting point is really taking a model of the brain that we first got from Bruce Perry and the Child Trauma Academy. And they break the brain into 4 basic regions: the brainstem, the midbrain, the limbic system, and the cortex. And so first and foremost, the brain develops from the bottom up, meaning that you have different primary regions of development at different times, and that correlates with what each region of the brain is in charge of. And so your basic life functioning, that is really controlled by your brainstem, and therefore your brainstem is primarily developing in utero. By the time you're born, you want your blood pressure, your heart rate, your body temperature, you want those things to be well regulated and operating the way that they need to be so that you can survive in the world. And then once you're born, then you begin to move on to some of that more physical stuff. And so for the first few years of life, you're really focused on learning how to crawl and how to grab things, how to move, some other basics like eating and sleeping, and understanding that, you know, just because you don't get food the second you're hungry doesn't mean that you're not going to survive. And so your brain is developing that and learning those basic skills. And then as you get a little bit older, you get past toddlerhood and you're moving towards those middle school years, that's when your limbic system is developing. And that's really the social emotional part of your brain. That's the part of your brain that's learning how to connect with others, how to relate to other people, how to kind of learn social cues and how to develop safe bonds, and how to know how to have appropriate emotional responses at different times. And then finally, the very top of your brain is your cortex. And with your cortex, that is that part where you have the abstract and concrete thought. That's where you can do creative thinking, you can design things, you can do future planning. It's where you can learn information, such as what we're trying to explore today. And you can take content and you can figure out, where does this content belong? What it is that I'm trying to do with this content. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the brain is that it operates largely from a bottom-up mentality, meaning that the majority of our senses, they directly go to the bottom of our brain. And then the goal is that that information is going to travel up really quickly to that top part of the brain where we can really make sense of that information, where we can work with it. And so, for instance, while we're speaking tonight, My hope is that you're seeing some things on the slides that are coming into your brains, going to the bottom. You're hearing me say some things and that information is coming in and it's traveling up to the top as you work to make sense of that content. And so it's getting up to your cortex. You're thinking about children that you've worked with before or your own children. You're thinking about some of the ideas. You're kind of hopefully having some of those light bulb moments where you're understanding a behavior differently than you had before. And you're recognizing why your child might be doing certain things. Or you're coming up with a new idea, some new plans, some new solutions for meeting the needs of the children in your life. And so that's the goal of what's happening. But what's important to realize is that that information is traveling a long way to get up there. And so that is optimally how the brain should be operating. And so a well-developed brain that hasn't been exposed to super high levels of stress or trauma in its life, that's how that information is hopefully going to go. But what we realize is that things don't always operate the way that we expect them to. And that's where stress really begins to come into the picture. And so obviously this being kind of the heading of what we're talking about tonight, this whole idea of stress, what we're realizing is that that can actually have this impact on how it is that we're going to learn, how it is that we're going to make sense of the world. Now, if you look up the word stress, you can find literally countless different definitions of it. All of them, I think, do a good job. My goal when I'm looking for a definition is always to find something that's as succinct as possible, as basic as possible, because I think the more basic it is, the better job I'm going to do at being able to actually remember what that definition is. And so the definition that I like the most is that it's anything causing physical, emotional, or psychological strain. And so it's anything that's out there, and each person is going to have kind of a different response to something that's potentially stressful. Two people could experience the exact same thing. One person could find it stressful, and the person next to them can find that it isn't stressful. It's going to be dependent upon, at times, their genetics, their life experiences prior, their support systems that are in place right now, their personality. There's so many different factors that are going to play a role in that. But we're realizing that really the gamut is wide open for things that have the potential. And it can be externalizing things that you experience, things going on in the world, such as a global pandemic, but it can be internalizing things as well. It can be caused by your own thought systems. It can be, caused just very internally, and you can bring that upon yourself. Now, what I want to be clear about up front, not all stress is bad. In fact, we absolutely need some level of stress to be able to really grow and learn. See, when we have a manageable, small amount of stress, that's something that's actually going to allow us to be far more attuned to something. So for instance, learning something is stress. Once again, my goal tonight is that information is getting up to your cortex and you're able to actually learn a little bit. There's a little bit of academic stress, but that academic stress is going to allow you to focus in on that information. And so it's going to allow you to kind of be in a spot where you can pay attention to it. You can work with that information. You can figure out what I say that applies. Some things I say you might disagree with or not be able to apply in your role. And so you know how to kind of push those things aside. And so you're able to kind of have that great amount of focus. And so not all stress is always going to necessarily be a bad thing. And we definitely need to keep that in mind. But the other thing is that sometimes stress, even when it's good, it might be a quantity of stress that we're just not prepared for at that moment in time, or that is kind of differentiated from other things that are going on around us. One very common thing with stress is that it can be caused, even if it's something positive, by something that's not predictable. I've heard Dr. Perry say this a few times. I've seen it in writing, and so I'm not going to give a perfect exact quote, but he essentially says that the brain prefers the predictability of something that's unsafe or chaotic versus the unpredictability of something that's safe. And so what's interesting with that is that the brain is saying, I at least know what to expect, and I find safety in that, and that's actually less stressful. Even though it's a negative thing, I know what to expect right now. But then when I move into a positive environment, suddenly that's way more scary because my brain's saying, this doesn't quite feel right. We've done a lot of work, and I just saw that there's a handful of you that signed up for this that are foster parents. And actually just last week in a training, I had this question come up about kind of that honeymoon period that exists sometimes when you're fostering or you're a new adoptive parent, where for the first couple of days or even weeks, things are looking really good. And then suddenly you begin to see that turn. And you see, what happens is when you're in kind of the throes of something that's new and novel and safe, it feels great. But then suddenly the brain begins to say, this is different from what I've experienced prior. Something about this isn't right. Pretty soon somebody's going to yell at me, snap at me, send me back, do something different with me. And so all of a sudden, their stress response goes way up. Their behaviors begin to change. Sometimes they're literally exhibiting the behaviors that are going to make the predictable response happen. I'm going to behave in such a way that causes you to yell at me, that causes you to want to get rid of me, because I find some sense of safety in that. Now, to be clear, quite often that's not happening on a cognitive level. That's happening from the survival parts of the brain, where it just feels like this is the right thing to do right now to create a more predictable environment where I feel more safe. This even happens in smaller ways, where once again, something that is seemingly positive, sometimes you end up seeing has a negative result. So a perfect example is sometimes holidays for people that have children. You might find that, oh, you have all these great things planned, but you're breaking some of the typical rhythm and patterns of what's going on. There's almost this hyper overstimulation of new things. And even though the days might be fun, often you'll find that there's evenings or follow-up days where behaviors are really difficult. And we get frustrated and it feels like, man, is this child spoiled, or what's wrong with this kid? Why aren't they so grateful for everything that was wonderful yesterday or everything that was wonderful earlier today? But in reality, it's not that they're not grateful for it. It's that it was stress. Even though it was a positive thing, it caused strain. All of a sudden, it was a different social strain. It was a different rhythm or pattern. It brought about a day full of unpredictability. Even though they were great surprises, it might have just been more than what the brain was able to carry. Now, we're going to see a lot of this, especially for those that are beginning to transition back into schools, for those that are beginning to have the opportunity to do more kind of social opportunities now, whether that be sports, whether that just be getting together with friends. What you'll find is that those are exciting things. But think about how significantly some young people's lives have been turned upside down for the last year and a couple of months. You know, what happened with so many of them is that about 95% of their social interactions have gone down to nothing or have turned into just a little bit of virtual interaction. And so even though they're looking forward to more opportunities to be together, suddenly when they transition back into schools or they transition back into social settings, it's fun, exciting. A lot of kids can't wait to get into it, but there's stress involved in that. And so you can predict that we're going to see some difficult behaviors begin to arrive when we have them kind of moving back into that. And so with that said, as we're understanding a little bit more of what stress is, and quite frankly, the fact that almost anything has the ability to cause stress, we want to see what's that going to look like and what's that stress actually doing to the brain. And so with that said, we really want to look at what Bruce Perry calls brain states, which is basically this understanding of how stress is impacting the brain and how the brain is really changing because of that. You know, we talked already about the fact that the brain develops from the bottom up, but what's fascinating about the brain is that it actually stresses from the top down, meaning that the more stress that's coming in, you begin to move and shut down those higher regions of the brain, and you begin operating more and more from these lower regions of the brain. So for instance, if you're experiencing zero stress, you're in what's called the calm brain state, where you're at the very, very top of your cortex. To be honest, you don't spend a lot of time here. You know, we don't spend that much time in our calmest brain state. That could be, you know, when you're at home in the evenings or on the weekend, you don't have any work to do, you're not worried about anything, you're not trying to accomplish any jobs around the house. You just feel 100% safe, 100% good, not a worry in the world. But then when you begin to add a little bit of stress, it could be the social stress of being around others, the academic stress of logging into a Wednesday workshop and trying to learn something new. It could be the authoritarian stress of being somewhere where you're around a boss or you're around other authoritarian figures. There's different things like that that just cause you to be a little bit more alert. Now, once again, not all stress is bad. And in fact, those low manageable doses of stress are a phenomenal thing to help us learn and grow. And so when you're having that small amount of stress, you're still in your cortex, you're just slightly lower in your cortex, and you're in that alert brain state. You're able to give attention and focus to different things. You can learn new information. You can learn and understand kind of who to trust and who not to trust and how to handle different situations and how you're supposed to act in different realms and different social circles, you can really be taking all of that information in. You can make tangible steps for planning things for the future, and you can look back retroactively and make sense of things that have happened in the past. Like, that's a spot where we want to be. And quite frankly, this is where we expect most young people to be at. When we're educating them, when we're supporting them, when we're trying to help them, what you'll find is that they are often expected to be in that alert brain state where they're ready to focus. But the reality is they're not going to be there as often as we want them to be. And so as more stress begins to come in and it's getting less and less manageable, whether it's because of the quantity of that stress or some of the specificity of it, where it's something that is just more overwhelming for them, something that's putting, once again, to go back to that definition, more strain than they can handle, suddenly they begin to move out of that cortex and you move into that limbic part of your brain. And the limbic part of your brain is when you're in what's called the alarm brain state. And this is where you're just in kind of that uh-oh spot, like, am I safe right now or not? And so your number one question when you're in that limbic part of the brain is, am I safe right now? Am I cared for? Am I respected? And so I always try and compare this to being in a dark alley in the middle of the night. You know, when you're in a dark alley in the middle of the night, you do not know that you are not safe, but you are sure questioning it. And imagine being in that alley and you're looking around to see, do I hear anybody? Do I see a shadow? Do I hear footsteps? Is there anything else that's going on around me? And as you're attempting to do all that, you're also trying to do your future planning and you're trying to solve a calculus problem. You can't do that at that moment in time because you're so focused on the moment and survival. A lot of our kids are going to be walking into our schools or waking up in our homes, and they're going to be in a spot more like this where they're questioning, am I safe right now or not? They're not immediately ready to dive into that high thinking, whether it's academic content, whether it's like the understanding of why they need to do certain things in the home. They're not ready to dive into that stuff right away necessarily, because a lot of them are spending a lot more time in that limbic part of the brain. And so we really need to think about our interactions, especially, once again, coming from a school-based perspective. We would think so much about when kids are coming into the building, when they're coming into the classroom. For those that are at home, it could be when the kid's waking up or when they're coming home or when you have different opportunities to interact with them. You know, our first interaction should just be, I know you can't really see a smile through the mask, but try and put on a big smile, a happy voice. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. We got so much great stuff to cover. I'm so proud of you for this or that or the other thing, and filling it with positivity. That's like seeing a friend with a flashlight at the end of an alley, and suddenly you know, I'm safe, I'm good, I've got nothing to worry about here. However, if they come in and we're all of a sudden, where's your homework? Why are you late? Why'd you sleep in? Why'd you do this, that, the other thing? Even though it's not inherently negative and there might be legitimacy to why you need to be asking those questions do not establish safety. And those questions begin to tell them, I'm not really feeling too safe right now. And that's like hearing footsteps in the alley. And now you have the answer to your question. Am I safe right now or not? Your answer is no. And when that happens, you begin to move even a little bit lower in your brain and you get to that midbrain. And when you're in the midbrain, now you're getting to that fear response. And now this is your body preparing for, I'm not safe and I know I need to fight. I need to run away. I need to do whatever I can to survive this. Sometimes it's more internalizing. I need to shut down. I need to zone out. And then terror is you're actively in the face of that danger. And those two really move and work closely together. Sometimes when we would teach this to our kids, they'd say, I'm never afraid. I'm never in terror. We'd say, you're right. For you, it looks way more like anger and rage. And so that's a bit more how it's manifesting for them. But they're getting lower and lower in their brain, and they're just getting more angry and they're ready to fight. Now, the reality is, especially in schools and in most of our homes, and hopefully the majority of the time in our communities even, physically, our kids are safe. There isn't an actual danger there. Sometimes there is, but more often than not, there isn't an actual danger there, especially at home and in the community. And when that's the case, it doesn't matter that there's not a danger there. This is how the brain is responding. In fact, this is a natural neurobiological response to stress. Our brain's number one job is to keep us alive. And so the more stress that comes, the brain says, I don't need future thinking right now. I don't need relationships right now. I just need to focus on me and to survive. And so I need to be ready to fight or run away or grin and bear whatever's about to happen. It's trying to survive something in that moment in time. There's not a single one of us who sits back and says, I just want to be a jerk today. I want to be mean today. I want to behave this way today. Well, that's not what's happening. But so often when we see these behaviors happening from young people, we begin to attribute that they must be doing it on purpose. And the reality is, for many of them, they're not doing it on purpose. Once again, it is a natural response to stress. And we need to see that, and we need to recognize that. Now, to kind of paint like a quick picture of what this can look like, and I think it's important that we hear this because this is not just something kids go through. This is something we can go through as well. And so sometimes there's one big thing that happens and we just immediately jump down to the bottom of the brain, but often it's actually helping us move slowly from the top a bit down lower. And I want us to keep in mind too, a couple slides ago, what the different regions of the brain are in charge of, because that's what's going to help us to really begin to connect some of the dots, if you will, as to where they might be operating from based on behavior. And so some of you, hopefully this evening, and I hope that I didn't really stress out anybody tonight, but some of you might have been at home and you were just completely relaxed. You just ate dinner, not a worry in the world, and you were in that calm brain state. And then you got the reminder, oh shoot, in 15 minutes, that Wednesday workshop that I signed up for starts. And so suddenly a small manageable amount of stress kicked in, and you hopped on your computer real quick and you signed in, and then I started talking, and hopefully you're making some connections as to what I'm saying. And so still, it's a manageable amount of stress. But then I keep talking, and maybe it feels a little overwhelming and it feels a little scary. Hopefully not, but maybe that happened for some. And then suddenly that stress becomes more than what we're ready to bear. It feels a little too much. And then you move a little lower and you get to the limbic. And so the limbic, remember, is that social emotional part of the brain. And so as you move down here, now you're beginning to think like, oh man, like this guy, like I hate him. Why is he saying this stuff? And so now it's no longer about the content. You're taking things personal. And so when somebody's moving down the brain, you're going to see that they're taking things more personal. You might not like me. You might be saying something mean about me. When you're interacting with a child that's getting into the limbic, this is where they're far more likely to say, I hate you, or why do you hate me? Or they're having these really emotional or relationally charged responses to things that aren't really meant to be emotional or relationally charged. And then as you move a little lower, if nothing's curing that, you're getting even lower and you're moving beyond your limbic system. You're getting to the bottom of your brain, which is that fight, flight, or freeze. And the best thing to do is to slam your computer shut if you're listening to me and you're tired of it, because you're just moving away from that. It's something more than you're ready to bear. And that's how you're going to flee away from the situation. And so what we see so often with young people is that as they get lower, it looks more and more like that work avoidance. They're moving away from something. They're getting a lot more physical. They're getting a lot more agitated. And so we can begin to see, and all of those things are signs that somebody's moving lower and lower in their brain. And we can begin to actually predict by those behaviors where they might be operating from. By the time you're at the bottom of your brain, it's honestly these really physical and almost explosive responses to different things that are going on. And so what we want to now begin to look at a little bit is just what are some of those signs that somebody might be experiencing stress. And so these are not in any particular order. And I also want to be crystal clear that this is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of different potential things that are signs of stress. But first and foremost, we have what I just alluded to a minute ago, which is work avoidance. And so what I want to be clear about, I almost hate utilizing that term, but that's kind of the common term that's utilized for this. Work avoidance implies that somebody is purposefully avoiding some element of work. But what we need to understand is that if you're experiencing stress, you're moving lower than your cortex, which is the part of your brain that's attuned to the work that you're being asked to do. And so it's less about work avoidance, and it's more the fact that in that moment in time, they're not prepared and capable of being attuned to that work. As we move a little to the next one, you get to this idea of constant movement. And so this is where you might be a lot lower in your brain and you're getting more to that midbrain level. And so you're literally, your body is responding in such a way that it's sending more blood to your hands and feet, preparing for that fight or flight response. However, if there's nothing to fight and nothing clear to run away from, you now just have this excess energy. And so this is where you might find a child that's fidgeting with different things, tapping on things, standing up, walking around, won't sit still, won't be able to concentrate on things, touching everything that's around the room. You see this kind of constant movement. That's a sign of stress. Seeking control. Now, this is a really big one. With trauma and with stress, usually one of the things that is so consistent throughout is that there is a lapse in one's control. And as you lose control, you lose that predictability that we spoke about earlier, and you begin to get more stressed. And the way that you want to relieve that stress is gaining control of a situation. The problem is it's often done in a way that's not very appropriate, not very respectful to us. And so it turns into this big kind of power struggle, if you will. And it's very kind of frustrating behavior that we're going to see somebody exhibiting. But when they're trying to take control of a situation, that's a sign of stress. Defiance, where all of a sudden, and sometimes that kind of links a little bit with that idea of seeking control, but anything we say, they are completely against. See, the reality is they were in a part of their brain saying, am I safe right now or not? And something occurred that caused them to say, no, I'm not safe right now. And we as the adult were present and we didn't keep them safe. And so suddenly in that moment, we're not considered a safe person to them. And that's why you're going to suddenly see them fighting against us, being defiant against us, because we weren't there to protect them or save them when they were asking that question. And so their trust for us in that moment in time has begun to lapse a little bit. And so that's where we begin to see that occurring. Infant soothing strategies. I know that's kind of a mouthful and might look a little bit odd on this list. But if you think about it, somebody who's in a newborn child only has a fully developed brainstem. And so the things that you do to calm down a newborn child literally are meant to activate that brainstem. And what you'll find for children and at times for yourself is that the things that you would do to calm down a newborn, you will see a child doing those things themselves. You know, what are some things you do? You swaddle up a newborn, you'll see them throw a blanket around themselves, bundle up real tight, even if they're not cold, just that need to kind of be bundled. They'll throw their hood over their head. There's something about that that's kind of swaddling. You'll see them rocking in a chair that's likely not meant to be rocked in. You'll see them putting things in their mouth. You know, no joke, yesterday, I'm working on this presentation. I'm literally on this slide of the presentation. I'm stressed by all the other work I have to do and by the fact that I really procrastinated until the last 24 hours to put this together. And I wrote down infant soothing strategies. And without thinking about it at all, I sat back and started chewing on the side of my thumb. And I realized I'm doing exactly what an infant would do. I'm kind of doing that oral activation where with a child, you put something in their mouth. And so it was a sign that I'm stressed. And I was like, oh my goodness, I need to do something to take care of the stress because I'm really not putting my best foot forward right now. And so we're recognizing that we gravitate towards those things. Now, the next two, sleeping and eating, some of that even kind of mixes in with what you might see an infant do or a younger person do. But one of the biggest responses to trauma and stress at times can just be to completely shut out and pass out or fall asleep. Or you're seeking some type of instant comfort. And so you're eating food. Often it's going to be something sugary or salty because you might not be able to handle the situation around you, but that brings this really kind of immediate good response. And then you can get really overly emotional. Once again, you're having kind of emotional responses to non-emotional things. You say, hey, did you finish your homework? And somebody looks at you and says, why do you hate me? Or they can't stop crying or they're really upset. Those are signs of stress. Now, what's fascinating about the brain is that our brain knows how to relieve stress. And so these signs of stress are also the cures for stress. Because literally, these behaviors that we see people doing, these behaviors that youth are doing that is getting under our skin, that's frustrating, that seems disrespectful, that seems purposeful, it's literally them trying to calm themselves down. And so our answer for how to help them is literally in their behavior. And so our job, though, is to begin to look at some of these behaviors of concern, these signs that a child might be experiencing stress, and begin to really think through how do we then provide this behavior in a more appropriate and socially acceptable manner. And sometimes it's really simple, and sometimes it's going to be a lot more complex than that. So, for instance, work avoidance. What often happens is you see what you believe to be work avoidance, which is a child kind of walking away from their work. They're avoiding it. Obviously, you use the word right there, where they're not engaging in it the way that we would expect them to. And the natural response from parents and teachers, such as myself, is we keep saying to them, get back to your work. Why aren't you doing your work? I need you to do your work. And so they're doing this thing that's calming them down because they're not in a part of their brain. They're now moving a little bit lower where they're not ready to engage in that work. And instead of checking in with them and making them feel good and safe, I just keep saying that thing that's stressing you out, get to it, get to it, get to it. And that's just adding more and more stress, which is actually increasing the likelihood that they're going to go lower in their brain. And so instead, we should say, oh, you're not doing work right now? All right, why don't we take a quick walk? Or let's just sit down and chat for a couple of minutes. Or, you know what, why don't you take a 5-minute break and encourage them? So they're not hiding that avoidance. They're not feeling stressed about it. When you give them permission to take those 3 to 5 minutes to, have a moment for themselves, and then we'll try and get back to it, all of a sudden, that's a huge stress reliever. And the fact that you're right there collaborating and supporting them begins to kind of show them that you're there to help. And that helps to actually relieve that stress as well, which is going to get them back to a spot where they're ready to get to that work more quickly. And if we come from a place of support, once again, thinking about they've moved into that limbic level now, and we want to be that friend at the end of an alley saying, hey, I've got a light, you're safe, you're good. And so when we can really be positive and supportive in that moment, rather than jumping right on, get back to the thing that's stressing you out, we're going to see that they actually get back to the work far more quickly than they would if we were just trying to drill that work in on them. Now, constant movement. The thing that I always say about movement is that if you see a child moving, we need to find a way to let them move, because they're either going to move on their terms or on our terms. But if they do it on their terms, they're probably going to get in trouble for it. And so you don't want them sneaking around. You might want to put some boundaries around it, but instead of saying stop, fold your hands, sit on your hands, instead of attempting to do that, once again, it could be, let's do a quick physical break. Or I'll tell you what, would you rather stand up while you do your work? Or, can you walk while you, do some of these things? Can you sit, especially for kids that are learning at home right now, can you sit on a swing and read a book? Can you sit on an exercise bike and, use a little lap desk so that you can have that physicality while you're doing something? You can build brain breaks in that have the opportunity to get some movement or get some exercise. And so finding ways to just bring about that physicality. And then next one, seeking control. While we can't allow a child to have control over an entire class, obviously, or at least the most of the time we can't, we can give them just small little choices. And so we want to give them the ability to feel like they have some control over what's happening next. And I have found that with children and with my students that even the simplest things begin to kind of give them that sense of control, which helps them to feel safe again. So when I can see that they're trying to seek it, I can say, oh, you can start your work now, or you can start it in 10 minutes. You can work on reading right now, or you can work on this worksheet. You can write with a pen, you can write with a pencil. And those simple little things, now it's not me saying, do this exact thing right now. They have a little bit of flexibility over how they're going to do that thing. And for a lot of kids, that's really going to provide that level of support that they need. Defiance. Once again, if they've lost some of the trust in us just sitting there telling them more and more things to do is really just going to create more of an issue. And so instead, sometimes it's either giving them a little bit of space from us, or if it's not giving them space from us, instead of telling them what to do, go back to repairing that relationship. Because they feel a sense of unsafety. And so if they're acting defiant, stop telling them what to do and start just talking to them instead of at them. We know the things that work for our kids. We know the common interests that we have. And so spending some time collaborating, talking through those things can be so extraordinarily helpful. With the infant soothing strategies, once again, utilizing some of those tools that we see different people doing. And so being able to encourage them like, all right, here's a rocking chair. Why don't you rock all day? Or I'm okay with you having a blanket, or, getting like a weighted lap pad and something that they could have over their lap or over their shoulders while they're working, building into some of those things. Jumping over to the eating one, sometimes having food in their mouth is something that's going to be calming for them, or allowing them to chew gum. And so looking at what they're already doing and finding a way that we can actually give them permission to do those things. Sleeping is one that we can't really do at school, but if you're at home and working and that's something like, allow them to take a nap in the middle of the day, even if they're older. If that's something that's going to relieve some of their stress, that's something that could be appropriate for a period of time. And then Like I said, with eating, like, it's okay at times to have just short breaks like that. We obviously don't want to encourage like super unhealthy eating habits, however. And then with somebody being emotional, making sure that we're giving them permission to express the emotions, because those emotions are real to them at that time. And at times it might be connecting them with somebody that can help them with their social emotional learning, or somebody that can help them, giving them some one-on-one support and some clinical support that they might need to be able to develop those skills or to deal with some of the stress that might not be appropriate for every other individual to be helping them or supporting them with. And so the goal is that we're trying to look at what they're already doing and find a socially appropriate way that we can really begin to make some of those things available to them. And so as we're really looking at that, the questioning that's become really popularized in any of the trauma-informed world is where we're beginning to change a lot of what it is that we say, how it is that we're really, talking to and thinking through some of the communication. And so before, the question was, what's wrong with you? And I know that as a teacher and as a parent, there have certainly been those times where I'm like, what is wrong with this child? Why are you doing whatever the behavior is that you're doing? For those that have more of a clinical background, you're looking at behavior and just trying to diagnose, like, what is it that they're doing? And let's give kind of a label to that. And we're saying, let's step away from that, at least for a moment, and say, what could have happened to cause you to react this way? And we're recognizing that the behaviors that we are seeing are about something more than what's right in front of us. That there is something else that's causing that behavior to occur. And I'll be honest, it's not always about answering that question. The child might not know. We don't necessarily have to know. But the reality is, to take words from Ross Greene and Stuart Ablon, kids do well if they can. Kids want to do well. People generally want to do well. Nobody's waking up wanting to disappoint, wanting to fail, wanting to let somebody down. And so when we are seeing behaviors that don't match up with our expectations, it's not a matter of will, it's probably a matter of skill. And it's a matter of some of the different events that might have occurred and how that stress has compiled to impact that child. And so we're realizing that there's something else going on that's causing this behavior to occur. And the question that we really want to be asking is, what can I do to help? Where suddenly we might need to take our pre-existing agenda, what we were hoping to accomplish, and begin to say, what do I need to do different? How can I support you right now? Because if we keep just trying to teach, we keep just trying to redirect, we keep just going with, once again, our pre-existing agenda, what we're going to find is that we're going to cause a lot more stress than we might otherwise be expecting to. And so we need to be really careful with that in how we might go about approaching some of that and supporting somebody, and realize that we need to stop and give them that support. And as they feel supported, they move back up to their cortex so that we're able to educate them, and they're going to be in a spot where they're going to be able to learn. And that's what's going to really create an environment where they can be a lot more successful. And what we ultimately really want to be doing then is thinking about, how do we really then adapt and change the environment and become a lot more proactive with a lot of these tools? And so in a future Wednesday workshop, we're going to dive a bit more deeply into brain plasticity, which the basics behind brain plasticity is that it's the understanding that our brain possesses this amazing ability to change. And literally all throughout life, our brain is going to be able to change. And another kind of word for that and a way to understand it is that your brain adapts. And so our brains are going to adapt to the environments that they exist in. And so, for instance, for this past over a year now, a lot of our brains have been existing in an extraordinarily stressful environment. And the more that we are consistently exposed to a high level of stress, we're going to be more stressed all the time. We're going to have a more negative outlook on things. And so we're not going to be able to handle things in the future as well. Even if and as we escape these stressful times, our brain has adapted and changed to begin to predict that things are going to be more stressful. Things are going to be more negative than they actually are. However, if we can create environments of low stress, and so we begin to move away from that, we're going to be able ourselves, and for those who we're trying to support, to be in a place where we're far more relaxed. And the more that we do that, there can be more of this positive outlook. And so as we think back about all of those things that we talked about, those things that we might do in response for a child who is really beginning to act up. The reality is we want to take some of those tools that we find works for an individual, works for a group, and instead of waiting for the child to need them, we provide those things proactively. And so as we can begin to put those things in place before they're upset, we're actually going to begin to avoid some of the stress because we're creating a supportive environment where that child is going to be far more likely to be able to thrive. That child's going to be far more likely to have low stress, be able to be relaxed. It's going to give them more of that positive outlook that we want them to have and put them in a better spot to be able to manage whatever it happens to be that's coming their way. And so our goal is, once again, to begin to alter the environments that students are in. And if I look at, once again, the silver lining behind everything that's happening is that we're finally rethinking, what does education look like? What do schools look like? Even what does a classroom look like? And we can begin to think, does it mean that we begin to put more and more tools in a classroom that are less focused simply on the academics, which are extraordinarily important, but recognizing as well that if we can focus on mental health, if we can focus on creating calm and approachable environments for students, that they're going to feel safer, they're going to feel calmer, we're going to avoid a lot of the behaviors of concern that ultimately come up, and they're going to be in a spot where they're going to be engaged in a manageable dose of academic and social stress, where we're going to begin to see them thrive more and more and more. And that's really the overarching goal of what it is that we're trying to accomplish here. And so in a moment, I want to begin to respond to questions. I know it'll take me a minute to kind of turn my head and look at any comments that have come through and any questions that you've asked. Hopefully you've been able to ask some throughout. If not, please feel free to share any questions that you might have. The other thing that I'd say is simply, if you enjoy what you've learned about, please keep coming back to these Wednesday workshops. If you want to learn more about it, please feel free to reach out to us. There's an email address there, training@lakesidelink.com. We've trained, had the humbling opportunity to train a lot all over the country, but also all over the world. And so we'd love to hear if there's any ways that we can help and support you and some different resources we have. Feel free to follow us on social media so we can keep you aware of other things that we're up to, and also, future Wednesday workshops. But from here, I want to begin to look at any questions that might have come in while we've been doing this. All right, so at the moment, I don't believe although I might not be looking at it all right, I don't believe I'm seeing any specific questions at this moment in time. The one thing that I see is a point that Nicole has made, which I really like, is how we communicate is really key. And what I think is important about this, and something that I've seen occur time and time again, is that we might be figuring out the right things to say and the right things to do, but so much of it plays out in how we say and do those things. And so I have seen amazing tools be handed out punitively. And so suddenly this tool that's meant to be stress reducing turns into something that really causes a lot more stress for an individual. And so we want to be really careful that we are avoiding that, because if we are coming across punitively, we're adding more and more stress instead of taking it away. And that's not going to be able to help a child out and put them in the spot that we want them to be in. So really thinking through that. And one of the things that's so core to that is that we're taking care of ourselves. And I know that, people talking about self-care is happening all the time right now. And I know that in some ways that's even frustrating, because I know that there's so much that's being asked, and then suddenly one more thing on the to-do list is, by the way, you need to take care of yourself. However, the one thing that I would just point out is that everything that we've talked about so far, it's not unique and specific to children. It really can apply to us as well. And so we need to find the tools that are advantageous to us. And a lot of it is looking at, what are we already gravitating towards when we're getting frustrated, when we're getting stressed out, and giving ourselves permission to do some of that. And so giving ourselves permission to kind of take care of ourselves, be in the spot that we need to be in. And for those that might be in authority, I know that there's administrators and CEOs in this, giving your staff permission, making sure that you're creating an environment that says we prioritize the mental health of our team. And so making sure that that's something that you're being attuned to and that you're encouraging so that your staff aren't afraid that they're going to get in trouble for taking 5 minutes to take care of themselves, that they're allowed to get up and move from their environment, that they're allowed to, do something that's not specifically work related for a few minutes so that they're better prepared to step back in and handle it. And quite honestly, for those of you that are parents and homeschooling parents, this is so incredibly difficult because you don't get a break. Your entire life is filled with something that at times is causing stress. And so figuring out what does it mean? What does it look like? And even utilizing it as an educational opportunity to figure out, all right, how can me and my child or children take self-care breaks together? And really allowing them to know that this is important. I need to be in a good spot to help you, but it's great to take care of yourself as well. And giving ourselves permission to be able to do those things is extraordinarily important. All right, I'm trying to see. So a question came in, do I think that behaviors that come in as chronic stress can sometimes manifest as a diagnosis? And what we're finding is absolutely yes. And what's hard, I'm not going to lie, there's a little bit of a gray area here because, all things that exist, for instance, like ADHD, there is definitely something that is that exists that is ADHD, but ADHD also looks a lot like somebody who's operating from the lower parts of their brain. They're going to be hyperactive. They're going to struggle to focus on any one thing. They're going to be explosive at different points in time. And what you'll find often is that the typical medication that one might use for it isn't going to be effective. You keep having to put the dose higher and higher and higher because you're really addressing the wrong problem. And so I absolutely, want to say we need to be mindful. We need to be careful not to assume everything's stress because there are other things that exist out there. But I believe that we can take an approach where we're trying to really think through a lot of these brain-based tools as well. And that these can really go a long way in being able to kind of help and support somebody as they're moving along. How do you hold a favorable reinforcer to allow the child to complete the request without it causing them stress, to pair it with the completion of tasks without it becoming punitive? And so if I'm kind of reading and getting to that, right, there's kind of this balancing act, if you will, that we're attempting to do where we're trying to support them. We're trying to get the task done. It's inevitable that there's, some stress that's going to be involved in that. We're trying not to be punitive through it. I'll be honest, it's going to vary with the different children. It's going to vary on different timings. One of the things that you might find is that once a child is stressed, anything we say or do in that moment is really hard for it not to become negative to them. And so with that in mind, sometimes what we have to do is do our best to survive that moment. But once we're calm later, and it might be later that day, it might be the next day, it might be the next week, that's where we begin to kind of put those plans in place for, you know what, when this happened, you really weren't responsive to me at all. I felt like there was nothing I could do to help and it wasn't really working and everything felt like a punishment. What can we do? And making a plan together and really bringing them into the process, I think, is extraordinarily important, and choosing some tools that they are choosing and them, once again, becoming part of that process so that now the next time you're finding yourself in a similar situation, hopefully before they're getting, a little too far down the line, we can remind them, hey, here's that tool that you chose. Here's that strategy. Here's that idea that you would be interested in, and trying to kind of bring it to them at that point in time. And so the more that you can be proactive with that, but bring them into the process, the more likely they're going to be to buy into it. Now, I want to be clear. Nothing here is a perfect science. I wish that it was, but human beings are so unpredictable. And so there's going to be times that you put a plan in place like that and it works amazing and they buy into that tool. And there's going to be other times where it's like, we made a plan and it didn't work. What's happening here? And there's a lot of factors that can cause that to occur, but a lot of it is, once again, we're just trying to build rhythms where we can really learn what are the tools that work for them. Are different tools going to be helpful at different times? How much does it matter who's offering the tool, when we're offering the tool? Do different stressors look different for them? And so being able to try and support them at different times is going to be really key. Are there other strategies besides breathing strategies to help students come out of the stress parts of the brain? So really to revisit real quick some of the things that we've spoken about. I mean, breathing is an amazing strategy. And even thinking just through some of like our basic needs. So whether it's a deep breath, whether it's, drinking water, getting some food. But once again, think about those infant, things that an infant would do. Those are great strategies to help to get somebody out from the bottom of the brain. What you're going to find with the bottom of the brain is that it is far less about what we can say. And in the moment, our relationship, if they're really at the bottom of the brain, our relationship with them means very little at that point in time. It's far more physical things. And so if they seem really, really upset, it's about bringing about calm. So you brought up breathing, but it could be, like we said, getting them swaddled, getting them rocking, allowing them to be able to chew on something, playing music that's at about 60 beats per minute, getting something calm like that that's able to continually play. Your heart rate tries to match that of the music that you're listening to. And so a heart rate that's become dysregulated because of stress is going to be more likely, if you're listening to that calming music, to try and get closer and closer to that 60, which is going to be something that's going to be far more calm for you in that moment in time. If they're a little bit higher, you can get into some like really basic movements. It could be, basic balance, which could be, walking a balance beam, taping a line that they're going to be walking on, standing even on one foot, getting them to hop on one foot or the other one. So you're getting that kind of basic balance. You're utilizing both hemispheres of your brain as you're attempting to do that. Utilizing your large muscles in a controlled way, getting them to move things around. Like, hey, you're upset. Maybe now's a good time for us to, move some of this furniture and rearrange things. Or can you help by carrying this box or this textbook? You need to read the situation. You don't want them throwing furniture around or throwing boxes at you. But if you're able to, getting them to do something a little bit more physical like that. Now, the trick is we want to maintain some semblance of structure and control to it. You don't want them, once again, throwing furniture. You don't want them doing something that's going to be, super high energy, because that in turn is accidentally going to end up just kind of amping them up more and more. And so finding a little bit of structured movement with that is going to be really helpful. All right, I'm trying to see what other questions we might have here. Sorry, I'm not able to siphon through all of them. So another great one, fidgets, getting something in your hand that you're able to work with, something that you're able to, literally manipulate and play with and fidget around with. You're going to see, once again, what they're already doing and giving them the opportunity to do that. Drinking water is kind of like a breathing exercise, but it's taking care of some of those, basic needs where we're able to really just provide some of that level of support that they're doing. And so being able to just provide some of that support. All right, I'm not able to move through a lot of these comments right now. So we are going to bring it to a close for right now. Thank you so much for participating. Please, once again, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We'll kind of look through, like I said, for some reason, it's not letting me get through all of the comments right here. So we'll try and find a remedy for that before our next Wednesday workshop. But hopefully we'll be able to get into some more of them. And if there's anything burning, feel free to ask us via email or through some of our social media platforms. And we'd love to help. But other than that, thank you so much. And we will see you next month.